Okay, let's go ahead and get started, and welcome and thank you for joining us. This is Bonnie McFarland, and I was just breezing through and looking at your smiling faces. So good to see you, and thanks for the thumbs up, Julie. Um, our team is all here again today, and you'll be hearing from each of them. We have Jeannie Keith, Adrian Balcazar, Evan Bartelheim, Amy Tomamatsu Garcia, and Rachel Garcia, and you'll be hearing from each of them. And just a reminder, they're not only here virtually today, but here every day to answer your questions. So it's good to hear from you. Please contact us. We do our best to answer your questions, and sometimes you ask the right questions that still need to be answered, and we have to seek those out. So thank you for those. I hope that you all received the responses from our last presentation a couple of weeks ago, and I hope those were helpful to you. So please keep those questions coming. All right, let's take a look at today's meeting. Next slide. Once again, seems like there is a lot that is to cover, and that means there's a lot on your plate. So some of the topics we're going to be looking about are school site councils and school plans. We've had a lot of questions on those, so we'll be taking some time to take a look at that. We're also going to have an update on the status of FPM, where that is. We'll be looking at the large federal congressional bill that came out, the CARES Act, and the implications for education. We'll also be reviewing the state SB 117, the COVID response funds, and a status update on that, and some of the other pieces that are included in that bill in addition to the funding. We'll have a brief LCAP update, because we're still waiting for some more information on that. And then we will look at some resources, the superintendent's forums. We'll also have an update on accountability and testing and some of the changes there and how that's going to impact your world. And then we'll take another look at CALPADS and where things are. And I think some things just came out on that. So, and then finally, take a look at, and we'll look at your questions. We'll answer any of them that we can as we go along. But let's review how we're going to proceed on the next slide. And as last time, if you have questions, we ask that you put them in the chat box. We'll answer as many of them as we can during the course of today's call. And then we'll collect all the other questions and we'll send out email responses. And we'll also use those for upcoming Zoom meetings to address some of those questions more in depth. So now I am going to turn it over to, yes, okay. This is just, you need a bit of a smile. If you're not used to the new normal, it's changing every minute. So that if this reflects your life, you're not alone. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Garcia, who's going to talk about the school plans.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rachel Garcia. We've received a number of questions on how to proceed with school site councils and school plans during this time of school closures. So we hope to provide some clarity on these topics. Currently, there have not been any changes to the legal requirements for school plans for Title I school-wide programs. And so that means that school plans must still be updated annually and approved by the local board whenever there are material changes. And so next steps for school site councils and school plans will depend on your local SIPSA cycle. Next slide. And so this chart just provides some SIPSA cycle considerations. And so if you have targeted assistance schools that were going through the school-wide planning process this year, in order to implement a school-wide program for the 2021 school year, then those plans will need to be approved by the school site council as well as approved by the local board. Now, if you have schools that are on a fall-winter SIPSA approval cycle, then no action is needed at this time. The school site councils would move forward with updating the school plans in the fall or the winter. If you have a spring-summer approval, SIPSA approval cycle, then school site councils should meet virtually to consider one of the following options. So option one would be that the school site council reviews the current school plan, and agrees to maintain the current SIPSA actions and services based on their review, and then would agree to come back at a later time, such as in the fall or when schools open, to review and revise the SIPSA at that time. And so this requires school site council approval. And so the CDE has provided clarity that board approval would not be required in this instance because there wouldn't be any material changes. And so board approval is only required if there are material changes to the plan, but school site council approval would be needed. An important note here is that 2021 funds may only be spent on actions and services included in the plan. So if there is something in the current SIPSA or something that is not in the current SIPSA that school site council would like to spend funds on, then the plan would need to be updated. The second option would be for schools that feel they are in a place to update or revise their school plan for 2021. So they would meet virtually to update or revise the school plan. And this requires school site council approval as well as board approval. Next slide. So here are some planning considerations for virtual school site council meetings. To meet the Green Act requirements, the agenda and virtual meeting link should be emailed to all families and staff at least 72 hours prior to the meeting. Other considerations include translating the email into required languages, providing instructions on how to call into the meeting if video is not accessible, how to provide comments, and also providing clear communication that public comments are strictly related to the agenda items. It's also important to consider translation needs and have an interpreter available for the virtual meeting if necessary. To ensure a quorum for the virtual meeting, schools could consider making personal phone calls to school site council members and also to ensure that members understand how to access the virtual meeting. And the number of meetings will depend on where school site council is in the SIPSA development cycle. Next slide. So here are some topics that may need to be addressed for schools moving forward with updating their plans virtually with their school site councils. And again, it really depends on where school site councils are in the development cycle, because some of these items may have been addressed prior to school closures. So one item would be the comprehensive needs assessment. And so this would be reviewing the available or current data and prioritizing needs. The SIPSA evaluation of effectiveness. And so this would be taking a look at data on actions that have been implemented up to the point of school closures and discussing which actions should be continued, modified, or eliminated. Another topic to consider would be input on 2021 goals and actions. So taking the recommendations from the school site council and also reviewing and discussing feedback from ELAC on goals and actions for English learners. And another topic would be reviewing, revising, and approving the 2021 SIPSA. And so some considerations with that is that the final draft of the SIPSA should be available for the school site council to review using the input gained from the previous meetings. And then at this point, the school site council members would provide final plan recommendations and approve the plan. Next slide. So here are some possible ways to maintain documentation in virtual meetings. In lieu of a sign-in sheet, consider taking a visual or verbal roll call of SSC members and also taking a screenshot of the participant gallery and attaching it to the meeting minutes. For documentation of SIPSA approval, consider using a chat tool and taking a screenshot of the results to add to the meeting minutes. For SIPSA signatures, such as the signatures of the school site council chairperson and the principal, considerations include collecting electronic signatures or obtaining signatures once the school site council is able to meet in person. Next slide. So at this time, I will turn it over to Adrienne.
Hello, everyone. This is Adrienne. In looking at FPM reviews for this year of 2019-20 school year, what we do know is that the 19-20 FPM on-site and online reviews are still scheduled to occur. We do know that the FPM on-site FPM reviews that were scheduled for April, May, and June were converted over to online. And with that, we hear that they are doing conference call interviews with school site council and staff members that are federally funded in your program. So that's something that is still going on. We do know that the 30-day upload deadline for the initial evidence is still in effect. So you still need to adhere to that. And we do know that the LEAs and charters are now allowed to continue uploading the evidence throughout the whole process, all the way up to the day before the close of review. We do know that they also have extended the time. So if your review typically was 3 days or 5 days or even 10 days, they've extended that deadline so that it's generally a kind of a 30-day period is what I've noticed on CMT in terms of what the upcoming FPM reviews are showing. What we do want to stress is that the communication is critical, probably even more vital during this time. So business is not as usual. So you want to make sure if you are up for review that you do beforehand, you do confirm the dates, confirm what programs, and you want to make sure that you know all the details of the FPM review that's coming up. And also make sure that you adhere to uploading all your evidence on the CMT system. During the FPM review, if you do have one scheduled for this year, remember that CMT is your mode of communication. It's where you go to respond to the CDE's need for clarification of your evidence, or if they request additional evidence. And perhaps this is where your negotiation and discussion of potential findings. So you want to make sure that all of this is happening during your FPM timeline. And then once the close of your FPM process has taken place, again, you want to remember that once you have a finding and now you go into the resolution of findings section of your FPM process. And so then you want to make sure that you know what your resolution deadlines are, specifically what evidence is being requested, and that there's a clear understanding. And again, you have to take into consideration, if it's a board policy, say for UCP, what does that look like? When is your board going to meet? When are you going to be able to follow all of those timelines within your own system and your own LEA or charter? And so you want to make sure that you kind of have thought that through. And then lastly, too, you want to make sure that if you foresee that your timeline is going to be altered because of, say, board meetings or school site council coming together, you will need probably to request an extension for your resolution of finding. And that, again, you would use your CMT system. You would request to that particular program reviewer and ask and give justification as to why, and also requesting a reasonable date, and not something far out in the future, but something that's reasonable to what's your timeline that you have available to you. And so if you need specific questions, the FPM office, there's the email. The FPM administrator is Clement Mock. And our Region 11, which is what LA County is, your FPM lead, our FPM lead is Malik. And so here's some contact information. And if you have any questions, by all means, please contact us. We're in direct communication with CDE, as well as we can help with the facilitation of utilizing the CMT system. Thanks, have a great day. And now we'll go to.
Okay, this is Bonnie, and we're going to now turn to the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This is the huge bill that covered multiple areas of relief, including health services, funding for people who've lost their jobs, and included in that are some education supports. And so we're going to focus on the education sections of the CARES Act. Let's take a look at the next slide, Before we go into the CARES Act, we want to share with you a resource we've developed, and it's on our website. It's the website you go to access our meeting notes on the LACOE website. And the PowerPoint's included on there and some other resources, but this is a resource we put together to help you kind of keep track of all the things that are going on with legislative changes. So this is a summary of state and federal legislation, regulations, and guidance that have come out in response to the coronavirus pandemic. So we will continue to update this, but as you can see, it's got the date that it came out, a bit of a summary, and a link to where you can find the actual document. What you'll see is that we've summarized what the legislation says, whether it's a waiver or funding. We encourage you to use the link and go to the actual document to review it if you have specific questions. This is just a summary. And the other thing, this is up to date as of, I believe, 1 o'clock today. So things are moving quickly, and we will continue to update this and get this out to you. So this includes both state legislation and federal legislation and guidance that have come out that impact schools. All right, so let's take a look at the CARES Act. It's HR 748. It's a little easier to find that way if you're looking for it. And if, in terms of education programs, it really does two things. One is it gave the Secretary of Education the ability to offer various flexibilities through waivers. And secondly, it provided funding for various programs. So in terms of the flexibility, it allowed the Secretary of Education to offer waivers to states. So states have to apply for these waivers on behalf of LEAs in the states. The information CDE has already applied or is in the process of applying for those waivers. The CARES Act requires the Secretary approve or deny requests within 30 days. However, the Secretary has indicated that the department will respond within 1 day to state waiver requests. So this is a quick turnaround time. The second piece is funding, and it includes everything for education. Funding is included under the Education Stabilization Fund. And there are 3 separate funding sources, 2 of which are particularly of interest to K-12. And the first is the Governor's Emergency Relief Fund, and the second is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. The third is for higher education programs for universities. So the first 2 we'll take a look at. Okay. Before we do that, we're going to take a look at the waivers that came out of the Act. As I mentioned, the CARES Act allowed the Secretary to offer multiple waivers. She has already put out 2 letters inviting states to apply for those waivers. The first one came March 20th, and that had to do with assessment waivers. As you'll note, the state had already, and the governor in his one of his actions had already waived state testing. However, if you notice in the governor's language, it said this was pending approval from the federal government in terms of ESSA requirements. Secretary DeVos invited on March 20th states to apply for those waivers, and there were 3 areas that she included. One was the requirement to administer statewide assessments to all students. The second was a requirement to identify schools for CSI and TSI support. And the third was the requirement to provide assessment and accountability in state and local report cards. CDE has already received preliminary approval from the U.S. Department on these waivers, and the formal waiver is in process. The comment period for these waivers is open through April 15th. Right. Then a second letter came from the Secretary on April 6th, and that allowed for a variety of other waivers, primarily fiscally related waivers. The first was the would allow states to extend their waiver authority, which now states can only offer a waiver once every 3 years for LEAs that exceed the 15% Title I carryover limit. This would allow states to request a waiver to be able to waive They can waive. This is getting very wavy here. The states would then be able to waive LEAs carry over more than once every 3 years. So in other words, if you've had a waiver request in the past and wouldn't normally be eligible to exceed the 15% for 2019-20 funds, the state could approve a waiver. The second also had to do with funding, and this had to do with extending the period of availability for 2018-19 ESSA grant funds. So these are your Title 1, 2, 3, and 4 funds from 18-19 that were set to expire on September 30th of this year. Most of you have spent those funds already, so this would only be applicable to a few of you perhaps, but if you have any unexpended funds, those would be available for an additional 12 months. This would appear to apply, although, to a number of you who have comprehensive support and improvement funds. Those funds were delayed to LEAs. They were their 2018-19 funds, but LEAs didn't get them until 2019, which gave you a short timeline to spend them. This waiver would appear to allow LEAs to maintain those funds for an additional year. The next three flexibilities are all related to Title IV Part A, and essentially all three of them allow LEAs to use the funds more flexibly, particularly to support technology purchases. The first has to do with the needs assessment. It would eliminate the need for the comprehensive needs assessment for 1920. And then the second one has to do with the content-specific spending requirements. These are the requirements that required you to spend at least 20% on a well-rounded education, at least 20% on safe and healthy students, and a portion of your funds on support for technology implementation. This would eliminate those percentages for this year, and it would also eliminate the restriction on technology purchases, which, as you know, now the technology portion is limited to 15% of the funds reserved for that purpose. So essentially, it would free up those Title IV funds to allow you to put more money into technology and support for online learning. Finally, the last waiver would change the definition of professional development to allow for training and distance learning. Currently, professional development needs to be ongoing, has to be evaluated. There's a number of requirements included that define what professional development is. This will allow districts to use professional development to support a variety of needs, including training in health-related needs related to COVID. Okay. And I should mention, based on those waivers, just this week, the CDE put out a request for comment on the waivers for those programs just mentioned, and they are moving forward with that waiver request. So we had questions, will CDE be applying? And the answer is yes, they are in the process right now of applying for all those waivers. Then there's the possibility of additional waiver authority. The CARES Act includes a requirement that the Secretary submit a report within 30 days to the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee and provide recommendations as to additional waivers that might be needed. And they specifically asked them to consider additional waivers on ESSA programs, on Perkins, and on IDEA programs. So we can anticipate there will be additional action and additional waivers coming forward. All right. Okay, now the funding that's in the bill, there's $30.5 billion total in the bill, and $13.5 billion for K-12 education and $14 billion for IHEs, or institutions of higher education. These funds are going to be available through September 2021. Okay, the first, I mentioned there were several pots, and the two pots were the governor's. The first is the governor's emergency relief fund. These funds go directly to the governor's office, and these are for both K-12 and universities. It's $3 billion nationally, and the funds go to states based on a formula that includes 60% of the total population age 5 through 24. Keep in mind, this includes universities. The other portion, 40%, is based on your 5 through 17 age census poverty data. These funds go to the governor and their emergency funds to support local education agencies that are most impacted by COVID-19. We don't have any information yet as to how those decisions will be made as to which agencies are most impacted, but that is the criteria the governor will need to use to allocate those funds. The second chunk of funding, which goes more directly to LEAs and will go to all LEAs, is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. Again, this is $13.5 billion that's going to go to states, and it's put out to states in proportion to the statewide Title I Part A funding. At least 90% of the funds have to go directly to LEAs. The state can reserve 10% if they wish for statewide activities, but most of this goes directly to districts and charters. The State Board of Education is going to apply to the U.S. Department of Education for these funds, and the funds will be allocated to districts and charters through the California Department of Education. CDE anticipates these funds are going to be available the end of this month or early May. They should be getting those allocations out. You should expect to receive this fund an amount approximately 20% less than your LEA's Title I Part A allocation for the current year. So CD is recommending you, for estimating purposes, that you estimate a little under a little less than 20% less, so under 80%, but approximately right around that amount. The funds will not go out as Title I money. They're just used the Title I formula, but the use of funds, as you'll see, is very broad. So it just uses the Title I formula, but this is not Title I money per se. Okay, next. Okay, so the use of funds, and we've got, I believe, at least 3 slides on the use of funds. So you'll see there are a lot of flexibility in this. First, funds can be used for any allowable ESSA activity, including services for homeless and other programs that are in ESSA. But it can also be used for coordinating with health departments and other agencies on COVID prevention and response. It can, the next one kind of shows you how broad the use is, resources to address school level needs. So really anything schools are needing, activities to address the unique needs of particular groups of students, your low income, students with disabilities, English learners, racial ethnic minorities, homeless and foster youth. So targeted activities for those students. Developing and implementing procedures to improve preparedness and response efforts. Next. Also training on sanitization and minimizing the spread of diseases is another allowable, and purchasing supplies for those purposes. Planning and coordinating for your long-term closures, meals for students, technology for online learning, carrying out IDEA and providing guidance on how to meet those requirements, and how to ensure educational services continue to be provided consistent with your state, local, and federal requirements. Finally, I think finally, we're getting close. Technology purchases, mental health support, summer learning, particularly addressing the needs, again, of low-income students with disabilities, English learners, migrant, homeless, foster youth, and activities to maintain operations and continuity and continuing to employ. So again, be approximately 80% of what current year's Title I funds are, and can be used for multiple purposes, should be available the end of this month or early. Will allocate CDE. We'll let you know when those are posted. Okay. Next. Included in the CARES Act is this requirement that LEAs that receive any funds through the state stabilization funds must provide equitable services in the same manner as under Section 1117 of the SEA, okay, as determined in consultation with representatives of the non-public schools. So what does that mean? Let's look at the next slide. What the 1117 defines the requirements for equitable services under Title I, Part A. So these funds are to be used to provide equitable services in that same manner, which means that funding would be based on the number of low-income students in Title I attendance areas, that services are to be provided to low-achieving students in Title I attendance areas who are attending private schools, and they should supplement the private school currently receiving districts services for eligible students. So this would apply to the governor's emergency relief fund and the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. So we anticipate guidance is going to be forthcoming, and we've been advised to keep looking for that guidance and follow up on that. But there does appear to be a requirement to serve private school students out of these funds. And that next fund is just a reminder, which is also in the CARES Act, that as with any other services for private schools, the control of funds and services is under the direction of the public school. So you have to, the public agency has to administer funds, materials, equipment, and maintain the authority for those materials. So they're your materials, your equipment on loan to the private school. Services need to be under the direction of the public school. Next, one other requirement in the CARES Act, which may have hit, and we had it already, some questions on this one, and this is payment to, continued in payment to employees. Section 1806 requires that LEAs that receive funds under the Education Stabilization Fund to the greatest extent practicable continue to pay your employees and contractors during the period of any disruptions or closures related to coronavirus. So if you have contractors that were that you had contracts to pay for services, you should be talking with those contractors and looking at how to repurpose that so they can continue to provide online services or some sort of support, so you can continue to support them as much as possible. Okay. All right. Finally, just want to share with you a document, and we have a link here to a document that is for parents. And this kind of gives you an overview of everything in the CARES Act. It's very short and simple, but it gives you kind of a bird's eye view of the whole act, not just the education programs. So this might be something that might be helpful for parents, family members, or staff who have questions about the CARES Act. And now I'm turning it over to Amy to take a look at the state level.
Yes, hello. Bonnie just shared the information about the federal COVID-19 funds, and this next section will be reviewing the COVID-19 response from the state of California. Governor Newsom signed SB 117, an education trailer bill, on March 17th, and it includes a number of protections for LEAs that have schools closed due to COVID-19. It also supports the governor's executive order N2620 that provides protections for school funding. The bill also waives other requirements and timelines to support the LEAs, schools that have closed. The allocation methodology in terms of funding for LEAs, SB 117 appropriates $100 million of funding, and the first apportionment will contain 100% of the funds to be received under this bill. The amount is calculated as about $17 per ADA, and a link to each LEA's funding results is here on this slide. Next slide, please. For use of funds, SB 117 appropriated the funding for the purchase of protective equipment and for supplies and labor required for additional cleaning of school sites. And this would be for LEAs that provided classroom-based instruction after March 4th and before June 30th. Nutrition, cleaning, personal protective equipment, and distance learning are the four stated uses of the funds, with the priority being health and safety needs. The CDE also released an appropriation letter on March 30th. In that letter, it stated that due to the emergency nature of these funds, The funding allocation formula and allowable uses of funds contained in their letter may not closely align with the appropriation language in Section 9 of Senate Bill 117. And if you did compare the two, you'd notice that we had some questions about the materials necessary to provide opportunities for distance learning. That did not appear in the initial SB 117, but did appear in the CDE's apportionment letter. And so CDE did say in their letter that the Department of Finance and legislator that the cleanup language will be forthcoming in future legislation. Next slide. SB 117 has 11 sections providing protections. And so we're going to, in this slide and in the next, we'll go over very briefly what each of those 11 areas are. Section 1 provides average daily attendance relief. Section 2 provides that instructional minutes and school days requirements are deemed met. Section 3 provides that charter schools may add independent study or distance learning programs without material revisions to their charter. Section 4 waives after-school education and safety program or ACES programs requirements to submit a request for pupil attendance credits based on a qualifying event. Section 5 waives attendance and reporting requirements for childcare and development programs. Section 6 extends timelines to assess pupils for English language proficiency by 45 days. And I know Evan's going to be speaking about that a little bit more towards the end of our presentation. Section 6 also extends the testing window for CASP, LPAC, and physical fitness testing by the length of time a school is closed due to COVID-19 or until the end of the testing window set forth in Education Code, whichever comes first. Next slide has the remaining pieces. Section 7 extends the timelines imposed for uniform complaint procedures in both the Ed Code and implementing regulations for the length of time a school is closed due to COVID-19. For example, if an LEA had a 60-day timeline for the resolution of a complaint and the affected school is closed for 30 days, then that timeline would be extended to 90 days. Section 8 extends timelines for proposed assessment plans for special education students and extends timeline to respond to the requests for student records by a parent or student receiving special education services under special education statutes, but not for general pupil record statutes or for federal requirements. Again, this is just a brief overview of these sections, and Section 8 is one that has some particulars I would need a more in-depth review. We're not really covering those at this moment. Section 9 is the $100 million appropriation. Section 10 states that if the Commission on State Mandates determines SB 117 contains mandated costs, then LEAs would receive reimbursement for those mandated costs. And Section 11 puts that bill into effect. So just a quick overview, yes. Yes, this slide is SB 117 in Section 4 provided the attendance reporting protections for ACES programs. And Ed Code 8482.8D allows for attendance credits for programs prevented from operating due to natural disaster, civil unrest, or imminent danger to pupils and staff. SB 117 allows for COVID-19 to be considered one of these qualifying events. CDE released additional guidance on Friday, April 10th in regards to ACES grantees and allows for the use of ACES funds to serve school-aged children of essential critical infrastructure workers through June 3rd, 2020. And in addition to before and after school programs, ACES programs can run during the hours that school is ordinarily in session. At this time, no similar authority has been granted for 21st century or assets programs. So this is relatively new information. There's an email address for additional questions to CDE, and the link is provided for that latest guidance that they released on Friday, April 10th, and they say that additional guidance is coming. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jeannie. I'm going to do a brief LCAP update. Next slide, please. At this time, what we know. While we continue to receive a lot of questions about the timeline and the status for LCAP, statute governing the LCAP has not changed. As you know, this statute includes the timeline for submission and cannot be waived by the state board or the state superintendent. So the requirement for each LEA to have an approved LCAP is a mandate that can only be amended by the governor or the legislature. We will continue to update you on any legislative updates or updates from the governor as they are available. Next slide, please. At this time, there's a lot that you can and should do. While the submission process and timeline for the LCAP may change, your LEA's commitment to equity, transparency, and accountability remain foundational to the legislation and the work that you are doing. We certainly recognize the challenges LEAs are facing and the need for keeping these principles at the forefront while shifting workload and priorities. As you are reassessing and adjusting your LEA's efforts to provide support to your students, families, and staff during school closures, continuing a process to seek valuable input from stakeholders and keeping them informed is especially relevant to understand and address the needs of specific student groups. Staying connected with stakeholders through the District English Learner Advisory Committee and Parent Advisory Committee will support an understanding of the experiences, successes, and challenges for low-income English learners and foster youth and their families and caregivers at this time. Such meaningful input from these stakeholders can inform decisions being made to address the unique needs, conditions, and circumstances, especially for the most needy students. In this time of crisis, continuing to seek stakeholder input is critical to informing decisions that are responsive to the barriers and needs that are becoming even more evident for the most needy students. And finally, as you shift to address the evolving context, keep track of your response to the crisis so it is clear what decisions were made and how resources were used to address the needs in your community in response to the crisis. Maintaining your documentation of what you have implemented prior to school closures and the changes you are putting in place, including your process for seeking and using input from stakeholders, will keep you well positioned to share at a later date how you responded to the needs in your community. Next slide, please. We wanted to share with you some of the resources being provided by the CDE that are focused on school closures and the needs of specific student groups. This Friday, the update from the Superintendent of Public Instruction provided a recap of the webinars that were provided last week. These webinars focused on distance learning and instructional strategies for English learners, distance learning innovations in special education with a focus on engaging parents of students with disabilities, and a series focused on wellness supports for staff and students. Next slide. The update also included information on upcoming webinars, which will be occurring this week. And the update identified 3 webinars to be watching out for, which include the principles for developing a quality distance learning approach and continuing 2 series in process, one focused on special education and the other focused on wellness for caregivers and students. And now I'm going to turn it over to Evan.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Evan Bartelheim. Just a quick update on testing and accountability. As most of you know, the governor had submitted a request for the waiver that's pending. There's a upcoming, you may have received also the request for input with regards to that. We assume that's a fairly perfunctory task and that there's no reason that the waiver will not be accepted. But a lot of questions have arisen related to both the SIPSA and potentially the LCAP. Should some variation of that be moving forward, as to how one could address a comprehensive needs assessment or to do a needs assessment in the absence of testing. First, we'd like to point out that the fall 2020 dashboard will most definitely be affected, and that will have an impact certainly on some considerations for both SIPSA and LCAPs moving forward, and the CDE will be providing additional guidance next year. In the interim, however, we'd like to point out that the fall 2019 dashboard would still be a very relevant resource for reflecting if you're choosing, as Rachel had pointed out earlier, to maintain your site councils using some form of telephonic or online meeting format, that you can still use the 2019 dashboard information as well as any local metrics that were completed prior to school closures. For those of you who are interested, there will be a WebEx next week, April 21st at 1:30. The registration link can be found at the CASP.org website. It's identified as being relevant to CASP and LPAC coordinators, but as we read the details, it looks like it'll be very useful for dashboard coordinators or anyone who has a stake in the dashboard. So highly recommend getting, and you need to register for that in advance. Next slide, please. So quick CALPADS update. This is how quickly things change in this world. We just got 30 minutes before we started, we got an update from like another CALPADS flash came out. However, it's largely a summary of what's already been out there, which is to say that the CALPADS end of year submissions, which are primarily for state and federal reporting and accountability requirements, those, as of right now, there have not been any waivers posted for those. Those are going to require some larger decision makers to make the determination. Either the governor or the state legislature or the U.S. Department of Ed are going to have to weigh in on waiving those reporting requirements, and so they have no direction has been given thus far. However, LEA should continue to maintain generic their normal CALPADS data, including enrollments and exits, and to the best of their abilities, their students with disabilities information. There's more detail about the students with disabilities and the reporting on that in the most current Flash 175, which I said came out this afternoon. And finally, as far as the submission for the data for the chronic absenteeism calculation on the dashboard, please note that that collection of that is related to the attendance collection only for apportionment, and there is no collection of attendance taking place during the closure. So any adjustments that will be made to that metric are, again, they're a larger policy decision. You're not expected to maintain collecting any of your attendance data during the closure. Next. So we have some upcoming Zoom meetings, and just one quick note, we did have an April 23rd and 24th in-person meeting scheduled. I'd just like to note that that meeting has been canceled as obvious, since we have extended the safer in place standing until May 15th at this point. So you can strike those from your calendar if you hadn't already. But we do have a state and federal program meeting coming up on April 28th, and we also have our LCAP meeting coming up next week, April 21st. Note the different links for those meetings, as well as the different times. So 1 o'clock for the state and federal, and 10 o'clock for the Zoom, for the LCAP meeting. Next. So finally, we've been trying to capture all of your questions, and if you hadn't tapped into it already, we take all your questions and we answer them after the fact, so we can put in some thought to our responses, and we will put that out in a question and answer follow-up that will be posted. Again, same link as the PowerPoint for today is noted on our state and federal programs meeting workshop page. and it'll also go out to our listserv as well. Also, a video of this will be included, a link to it will be included on our website. We are finished with the meeting for today, but we'll leave open the question and answer section. We'll leave it open for a few minutes. So if you have any additional questions, you can drop them in the chat now so we can address them. And as always, we can always be reached via our sfp@laco.edu email address. So if you think of something after the meeting's over, please feel free to send your question there and we'll include that in the meeting. But thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you're all healthy and safe.